But I think we are getting very close to a situation where we could see the Mutual Defense Treaty invoked. And now, if the Mutual Defense Treaty is invoked, the United States enters into an armed confrontation with China on the side of the Philippines.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. A rather bizarre incident occurred recently in the South China Sea off the coast of the Philippines. On June 17th, the Chinese Coast Guard clashed with Philippine naval vessels en route to resupply a stranded Philippine ship on a formation known as the Second Thomas Shoal. This desolate shoal is very much in the territorial waters of the Philippines, but China nonetheless claims it as Chinese sovereign territory. The Chinese have routinely harassed Philippine ships in the area, but on June 17th, the Chinese Coast Guard attacked the Philippine naval vessels with water cannons, swords, and axes. This was the most violent incident of its kind in years. And this kind of escalation risks drawing in the United States for the fact that the US and the Philippines have a very long-standing pact known as the Mutual Defense Treaty that in theory obliges the US to come to the defense of the Philippines. And this has the potential to draw the US and China into direct conflict. My guest today, Prashanth Parmeswaran, is founder of the ASEAN Wonk newsletter and fellow at the Wilson Center. We kick off discussing what exactly happened in that June 17th incident before having a broader conversation about the dynamics in which this territorial dispute in the South China Sea draws the US and China closer to conflict and how to escape that dynamic. I always love speaking with Prashanth Parmeswaran. I subscribe to his ASEAN Wonk newsletter on Substack. You should too. It's really good. And of course, while you're there, you should subscribe to Global Dispatches, which you can find at globaldispatches.org. Subscribing to Global Dispatches gets you full access to our entire decade of archives of content on Global Dispatches, as well as full access to our new show about the UN, To Save Us from Hell. You'll also be supporting us as we try to keep the lights on around here. So thank you. Thank you for getting a paid subscription to Global Dispatches. I'll post a link to it in the show notes of this episode. It really does help. All right, now here is my conversation with Prashanth Parmeswaran, who writes the ASEAN Wonk newsletter and is a fellow at the Wilson Center. Prashanth, just to kick off, can I have you geographically situate the Second Thomas Shoal?
So the incident on June 17th that we're sort of talking about between China and the Philippines concerns basically a garrison in Second Thomas Shoal, which essentially is something that the Philippines has essentially been claiming and taken possession of since 1999. But it is something that China has contested since then as part of its 9-line that basically goes all the way through most of the South China Sea between China and Southeast Asia. And this is where essentially in 1999, the very controversial way that the Philippines took possession of Second Thomas Shoal is essentially by grounding intentionally a Philippine ship that has since been rusting over there. The big issue at play that we're seeing now in the last few months is the Philippines is trying to basically send in reinforcements for this garrison, including supplies for Philippine personnel who are there. And China basically is trying to intercept that from happening because they are actively challenging that claim. So technically, the legal definition of Second Thomas Shoal is that it's legally designated as a low tide elevation, legally speaking.
What does that mean, like legally speaking?
I mean, essentially, what it means is that if you want to put it sort of in plain speak, this is not a gigantic island. It's just a sort of a partially kind of submerged feature on which a ship has been grounded. Don't picture sort of a large island that's occupied by hundreds or thousands of people. That's not what we're talking about here, right? Essentially, what we're talking about is a very small sort of feature that the Philippines is claiming as part of its claims in the wider South China Sea. So this is something which it's going to come to a head, and we're already seeing that because the ship that the Philippines ran aground back in 1999 is essentially rusting. So once this ship rusts and disintegrates, there really isn't going to be much that's going to reinforce the Philippines' claim because there's not much there.
Hmm.
And so China could then go in and just, occupy it.
Moor its own ship there, essentially.
Exactly. So the dynamic you have here essentially is the Philippines understands that their position essentially is one of a declining balance of power because China's capabilities are growing and the ship is rusting. And of course, they won't say this kind of publicly directly, but
Hmm.
once it disintegrates, basically the Chinese ships, and they've maintained almost a near constant presence there, are just going to take it,
Hmm.
right? And so they're trying to reinforce their position. China's trying to block them from doing that because it understands that over time, if they can keep the status quo is essentially in China's favor.
Just to like give listeners a sense, if you can imagine like a Venn diagram, one circle is this China 9 dash line, which is their territorial claims in the South China Sea, claims I should note that have been rejected by international courts. But nonetheless, this one kind of part of the Venn diagram is the 9 dash line, China's claims. The other is the Philippines' sovereign claims, their economic exclusion zone, it's called. And this little Second Thomas Shoal kind of fits in the middle of that Venn diagram where the two overlap. And you referenced just now that incident on June 17th in which there was a clash between Chinese forces and Philippines forces. Can you just explain what happened on June 17th?
Yeah, so just to reinforce what you said earlier, because it's important, the arbitral tribunal ruling in July 2016, essentially, it's a very extensive ruling, but it basically found that China really has not any lawful kind of maritime claims to the waters around Second Thomas Shoal, which, as you pointed out, it lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, which all countries are sort of entitled to. Now, the issue with that is when the ruling was issued, the Philippine president, who was then tasked with promoting the ruling, was former President Rodrigo Duterte, who basically essentially set aside the ruling and wanted closer relations with China. And now you have a dynamic where President Marcos has since come to power in the Philippines, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., and he has a very different approach to the South China Sea and the United States and China, which is much closer to the United States in terms of the US Philippine alliance. And so that's why you've had a revival of this issue. And so what we've been seeing essentially is a number of incidents, including China firing water cannons on Philippine vessels, all the way leading up to the situation. The reason why the June 17 incident is significant in terms of what happened was you didn't just have an instance where you had water cannons, blinding lasers, which are very serious incidents. But in this case, you actually had Chinese maritime personnel who were wielding weapons, including, I mean, based on footage that we've seen that's public and anybody can view it, put out by the Philippines. They had knives and an axe. They forcibly boarded and intercepted the Philippine vessel, and the Philippine soldiers were sort of in rubber boats trying to deliver supplies to the garrison in Second Thomas Shoal that I mentioned. And several soldiers were injured as a result on the Philippines side. One lost a thumb, and that made a lot of headlines because this is essentially another step up that China has taken in the escalation ladder in the South China Sea.
Like you go from shooting water guns at people to boarding a ship with knives and axes and apparently getting to like fist fights that result in the loss of a thumb. And the idea is like, what could happen next?
Right. If this were to happen to Malaysia or Vietnam or Brunei, which are the three other South China Sea claimants, which also have claims against China, the United States would not be involved as directly. But in the case of the Philippines is a treaty ally, and not just a treaty ally, but under the US Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty that was signed back in 1951, it says that in the event of an armed attack, both sides will sort of act to meet the sort of common dangers that they're confronting. Now, you can parse and say what constitutes an armed attack, what doesn't constitute an armed attack. But I think we are getting very close to a situation where we could see the Mutual Defense Treaty invoked. And now, if the Mutual Defense Treaty is invoked, the United States enters into an armed confrontation with China on the side of the Philippines, possibly on its own, possibly in concert with other allies and partners. That would be a huge escalation. And that's where we see a lot of worries about potential escalation that involves beyond just the Philippines and China. So on the surface, it's just about the Philippines and China, but it really is about a lot more in terms of the stakes.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds ridiculous to say, but there is a scenario in which a water gun fight escalates into armed conflict between nuclear powers.
Mhm.
And that's just like a frightening thing to imagine. But, it's in the realm of possibility. And we saw, an iteration of this happen just over the last few weeks with that June 17th incident. So, what was the sort of immediate, and now we're a few weeks beyond that incident, what has been the consequence of that violent incident on June 17th?
Publicly, the message that has been, tried to be communicated on the part of the United States and the Philippines, especially, is that there's a need to kind of de-escalate the immediate situation to make sure that nobody says that anybody's looking for a fight or an armed conflict. But I think it is safe to say that there will be private conversations that are occurring, and I think we've seen some reporting about this as well, in terms of conversations that the United States and the Philippines are having about what happens in the aftermath, what can they do to basically reinforce the US-Philippine alliance, conversations between the United States and China about signaling what will happen if this situation continues. The trend that we're seeing with respect to China and the South China Sea is China essentially tries out a particular action and it seems like a one-off. You have people reacting, lots of headlines, and then this essentially becomes the new normal. We saw this with the water cannons that you mentioned earlier. It happened once, and then it has happened several times since. So the big question now, and I think the big fear really is this going to become the sort of new normal in terms of one step up the escalation ladder? In short, are we going to see more instances in the future of Chinese personnel boarding Philippine vessels, engaging in armed confrontations, potentially causing injuries and potentially causing even death? And if that happens on a more routine basis, we are definitely in uncharted territory because that is very close to triggering the Mutual Defense Treaty. I mean, even a very reasonable reading of armed attack would put you in a situation where you would essentially have to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty. Now, whether you want to invoke it or not, really, I mean, you can talk about the actual facts on the ground. It's a political decision by both sides, right? And the Philippines would have to request that on the part of the United States because they're the actor who is in this situation. But I think that's the big fear. I think the other part, what we're also seeing in this is the United States and other countries beyond just, so I mentioned the United States and the Philippines are talking, the US is talking to China. There's efforts as well for China and the Philippines to engage in a conversation, but there's a huge gap of expectations. Essentially, China thinks that the Philippines is changing the status quo in their view from the Duterte administration, where things were, from their point of view, much more of a reasonable position. But the Philippines has an incentive to actually shore up its own position, and China doesn't want them to do that. So there's a huge gulf of expectations there. It's also safe to say that there are conversations going on between the United States, Philippines, and other partners. So think Japan, Australia, but also other countries that have been more active with respect to the Philippines, most recently European powers, for example. We're looking at a NATO summit level engagement essentially being held, including one here in the United States. The intersection between the Indo Pacific or Asian theater and the European theater is another place where the South China Sea has more global significance beyond just the South China Sea or Southeast Asia.
On this particular incident, I mean, it's curious and interesting to me that the Philippines Navy didn't try to shoot at or repel the attack by axe wielding Chinese militants. Is that just because they did not want to trigger escalation? Is there like conversation in the Philippines media about like what drove the response and reaction by the Philippines Navy in their smaller, lighter boats?
I think part of that is, the vast asymmetry of capabilities
Hmm.
between China and the Philippines. So, in terms of the sort of naval and maritime forces that China has, China calls its Coast Guard a Coast Guard, but in reality, China's Coast Guard, its vessels are larger than the navies of most of the countries. The Philippines, among the major South China Sea claimants, which include Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei, is among the weakest. It traditionally has had one of the weakest militaries in Southeast Asia.
Because they have this pact with the United States that presumably will defend their territorial integrity.
I mean, that's part of it. I think there are also other considerations as well, such as the fact that the Philippines has had this debate between internal security considerations and external security. So they have an insurgency in the south, which they're now trying to enter into a political settlement. They've had confrontations with communists before. Lots of problems with the political system as well, in terms of making sure that there's a lot of organization and focus and consistency in military modernization. But you're absolutely right to point out this dynamic where it's part of the domestic conversation among parts of the Philippine public and also parts of the Philippine elite about the extent to which the US Philippine alliance produces dependency on the Philippines to not actually take its own capabilities seriously. And on the other hand, yes, there is that dependency, but also having the US Philippine alliance means that the Philippines doesn't need to invest in those capabilities and can also focus more on economics. And obviously, that's a trade off that we're seeing not just with the Philippines, but also in the former Trump administration. We saw President Trump and his advisors questioning European countries about why they're not doing their own defense spending. So there is that capability issue. I also do think, though, that there is a intent on the part of the Marcos administration, and they've kind of publicly signaled this a couple of times as well, to say we are not going to go down this route of, if you ram our vessels, we're going to ram your vessels. We're going to engage in the same behavior because the Philippines wants to make sure that international law is on its side. It doesn't want to be seen as a party like China that is violating international law that would also lead to other countries like the United States and other partners to question what they're standing up with the Philippines for, right? So there's a careful balance between the actions that the Philippines is taking and then also trying to make sure it's aligned with their principles. Now, how this conversation is playing out domestically in the Philippines, President Marcos, if you look at public opinion polls dating back to when he first came into office, consistently the South China Sea and sovereignty of the Philippines is among the issues that he does the most well at. And also, it's where the Philippine public is mostly aligned with him. Where he's not doing so well is actually on a lot of the economic issues, like inflation and so on and so forth. So there is a sort of recognition in the Philippines that this is a major issue. But there is also a recognition among segments of the Philippine population, some of them closer to President Duterte and his approach, which is, I mean, great that we are pushing back against China in the South China Sea, but frankly, are we also losing out on some of the economic opportunities with China? And if we're losing out on those, okay, but what are we getting in return from our allies and partners like the United States, Japan, Australia, and so on and so forth to basically compensate for the lost economic opportunities we're getting from China? And that's part of the reason why you're seeing the United States, Japan, and other countries, including when the Biden administration hosted a trilateral summit here earlier this year between the United States, Japan, and the Philippines, to make economics a central piece of this, because that is essentially the crux of the challenge for President Marcos. And he's heading into a midterm election next year in 2025, which is going to be essentially a referendum on his performance to date.
I have a question about the U.S. response to this incident in particular and issues related to the Philippines and the South China Sea in general. So I have to imagine that there is a conversation ongoing in Washington about how this incident on the 17th demonstrates like a failure of deterrence. Are you seeing that conversation unfolding? Do you agree with that premise that China feels like it can attack the Philippines in this way because it doesn't sense that it's being deterred by any sort of meaningful U.S. response?
I think you're right to sense that. I think in particular because we are in a situation where we've just had, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we also had the incidents that we saw in Israel, where in some circles those have been considered failures of deterrence. Now, we can debate the logic of that and the merits of that.
Yeah, I mean, like here though, there is this like pact, this 1951 Mutual Defense Pact on paper that presumably is meant to deter incidents like this.
Right. Although I do have to say, I mean, the Mutual Defense Treaty, as I mentioned earlier, there isn't really a military sort of switch that goes off whenever the treaty is triggered, right? It's essentially a political decision on the part of both sides. I think the situation in the South China Sea, to your point about deterrence, is serious because of the historical pattern that we've seen over the past decade or so. And that's how it factors into China's calculations. So if you go back to the 2010s under the Obama administration, there was a situation in Scarborough Shoal, which is a different feature that we're talking about now. We're not talking about Second Thomas Shoal, where the United States tried to broker an agreement between China and the Philippines, essentially saying to China and the Philippines, both of you kind of withdraw from this feature and let's allow tensions to de-escalate. And what happened was essentially the Philippines backed off. China basically came back and occupied that feature. And China has occupied Scarborough Shoal since. Thereafter, you had China embark on an extensive artificial island building campaign that involved not just the Philippines, but all of the South China Sea claimants, which were very alarmed at the situation. The United States publicly issued warnings to China. I recall President Obama, even when President Xi was in the United States, saying that there was a commitment from China not to militarize these artificial islands that they were building, essentially out of sand, essentially building islands that were not there and claiming that these were things owned by China, and then installing various military facilities there that could be used in a contingency. And China was allowed to do that. And the United States basically did not do anything in response. So essentially, if you boil it down to, I think, how some folks in the Philippines view this, it's essentially the United States is on strike three currently with respect to the Second Thomas Shoal. And if we see a failure of deterrence with respect to the Second Thomas Shoal and no invocation of the Mutual Defense Treaty, if it reaches that level of armed attack, and if the Philippines does ask for the United States assistance and it's not provided, that will be a huge situation. Now, I'll also say this is something that's played out in the past few weeks. It's not new. When U.S. and Philippine officials were at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, which is this Asia Security Forum that's held annually, President Marcos was the keynote at that Shangri-La Dialogue that happened a few weeks ago. And essentially, when he was asked a question about what would trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty publicly, he said, if there is an injury to any Filipino, it would, in his view, actually trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty. Secretary Austin from the United States then came in and he was asked the same question. He wasn't as clear about that as President Marcos. Now, this is important because China is very fond when you try to imply that there are red lines that are drawn. Basically, China will try to erase those red lines or basically go right up to that red line and test the resolve of both the United States and the Philippines. And that's why I think your point about deterrence is an important one, not just in terms of what the United States is thinking, but I definitely think that a lot of regional observers are asking the same question about the United States. And we are in an election year as well. So there is that additional question mark as well about what will happen in 2025, not just 2024.
So I guess between now and the election, because, what happens in the US election obviously has profound implications for Asian security in general and the Philippines in particular. But I guess between now and then, what will you be looking towards that will suggest to you how this conflict may, on the one hand, escalate, or if there are opportunities for de-escalation and for calmer heads to prevail?
I think what has been hoped for by policymakers on all sides, given the very alarming trend of escalation that we're seeing, is that there might be an opportunity for some sort of understanding between China and the Philippines that essentially is at least addressing this major gulf of expectations between, as I said, the Philippines trying to basically reinforce its position in the South China Sea that was eroded under President Duterte, and China seeing any change of that Duterte position as being essentially the Philippines trying to change the status quo. In reality, we all know that the Philippines has to reinforce its position because it was severely eroded. It's going to have to do that. But we also recognize that if that reinforcement of the status quo extends beyond a certain measure, China will have to essentially engage in armed conflict. So that will have to be an arrangement worked out by both sides. I think you're already starting to see some of the outlines of that, I think, become clearer. I mean, essentially, it would involve the Philippines. They've introduced a number of these resupply missions to Second Thomas Shoal. There's an expectation, I think, by Beijing that those be announced ahead of schedule, or that China would have some sort of warning about what's going to happen. That's an expectation, I think, that the Chinese have. Now, for the Philippines, that's a complicated situation because it has to do with the coordination of actors domestically. I think the other thing that China would want some assurance from, which is very difficult for the Philippines to sort of provide, would be no reinforcement of Second Thomas Shoal that amounts to a changing of the status quo or reinforcement of it rather than resupply, right? So essentially, there's a distinction that some folks in Beijing would make between, essentially providing food and basic provisions for Philippine personnel that are on Second Thomas Shoal versus bringing things like concrete that are clearly designed, in Beijing's view, to basically keep the Philippines' position there in perpetuity and basically reinforce and strengthen that position. I also think there are conversations that will be happening between the Philippines and China. As they are talking through these negotiations, the reality is that part of that will be determined by the military balance of power. And the military balance of power is such that if China starts to exert its influence, the Philippines is going to need help from the United States and other partners. And so there have been conversations about what is the U.S. role in terms of potentially providing more frontline assistance for some of these resupply missions in Second Thomas Shoal. The U.S. has done this in more indirect ways in the past, but if the United States were to do that directly, I think China would constitute that to be an escalation or a change in the status quo. That would help boost Philippine capabilities in that sense. But we're also getting to a point there where the United States and China are in a more direct path to confrontation. So that's what I would expect to see. I also think you're seeing the usual stuff in the public domain, right? The United States and U.S. officials saying they're very committed to the U.S.-Philippine alliance, reminding people about the Mutual Defense Treaty. But as we've been both talking about before, the Mutual Defense Treaty rests on it being triggered in the event of an armed attack, right? So, sort of pro forma statements about MDT matters and the U.S.-Philippines have an alliance, that's something that we've been saying for years. There needs to be an actual understanding about what is the threshold for basically invoking that. And that's got to be expectation management on both sides when neither side particularly wants a conflict right now, given political dynamics on both sides domestically.
Prashant, thank you so much for your time. This was really helpful and timely.
Great. Good to be with you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.